Perhaps you've been frustrated by the process of knitting socks on traditional double-pointed needles. That might be why you want to give flexible double-pointed needles a try. We're going to look at knitting a pair of socks on flexible double-pointed needles from cuff to toe. Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a master hand knitter and a knitwear designer, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. We've been looking at all of the different ways you can knit socks from cuff to toe using all the different methods, and this time it's going to be with flexible double-pointed needles. Now, these work sort of like using double-pointed needles, but slightly differently, and we're going to go into all of the details with that. If you want to knit along with me, you'll find the pattern linked down below, and we're going to jump right into it, take a look at our needles, at what the sock construction is going to look like, and all of the other supplies that we need. So let's go to the overhead. Let's start by taking a look at the needles themselves. So a set of flexible double-pointed needles has this little flexible, sort of like a circular knitting needle cord in the middle with two needles, one on each end, and it comes in a set of 3. Now these are Addi FlexiFlips. They're also called Addi Craysitrios. Other brands have them as well, like Hiya Hiya Flyers. This particular pair, each needle is about 8.5 inches long, which with 2 tips that are about 3.5 inches each. And when you knit a sock, you usually divide the sock in half, like you would if you were going to do magic loop or 2 circulars. Half of the stitches will be for the instep, would be on one needle, and then the other half for the heel or the sole of the foot are on the second needle, and then you have a needle that you can work with. Along with our needles, I'm using a US 1.5, which is a 2.5 millimeter needle, but you can use the size you like for the socks you knit. And you're also going to need 3 stitch markers, 1 for the beginning of round, and then 1 when we do the heel, and 2 when we do the toe. So 3 all together. And of course, you're going to need a tapestry needle to weave in the ends. And our yarn, for this sock, I'm using Knit Picks Hawthorne Fingering. This is their picnic color in the Kettle dye yarn. Now it is superwash fine Highland wool and polyamide, machine washable, so a really great sturdy yarn for socks. So this is the sock we're actually going to knit on our flexible double-pointed needles. It's just another basic rib sock, but this time it has some garter stitch in there. Instead of 2 purl stitches, we are alternating to make garter stitch in between. And we're also going to continue that right down onto the heel flap. And then the heel is what's called a handkerchief heel. It's made just like a round heel, but it starts right in the center and you get more of a triangle shape. And then after the heel turn, we've got to pick up for our gusset stitches, and we use the garter stitch along that's in between our knit stitches for our rib is what we're going to use to pick up stitches. We're not going to be slipping stitches. We're going to be working garter edges and then using the garter bumps to pick up our stitches. And I like to move it in like sort of between the 2 stitches instead of pick up the stitch directly on the end, which does give us almost like sort of a seam on the inside, just along the edge of our ankle. And then we're going to continue that pattern down to the toe. And the toe has a lot of different names. Sometimes it's called a star toe or a round toe. We'll just refer to it as like a 4-point star toe because we're going to decrease at 4 points. If you think of a regular sort of a wedge toe where you decrease 2 stitches on each side, we're still decreasing 4 stitches, but we're changing the placement of the stitches so we get this round shape. And I'm going to show you how to work them 2 different ways. This one sort of goes off in this direction. I'm going to show you on the next sock how we can get it to go off in this direction. So you can have 2 toes that mirror each other, or you could work them exactly the same. And I did finish this one with just a tiny bit of Kitchener graft on the end, but you don't have to do that. We're going to end with just a few stitches. So if you like to do, just break the yarn, loop it through those final few, and then pull it tight, sort of like you would for a hat, that is another option as well that we'll discuss when we get to the toe. So this is the sock we're going to work on. And of course, we have to start by casting on. And you have a few choices for that as well. Of course, you're going to need your pattern. If you're following along with me, you'll find that linked down below. And for my sock size, I'm going to cast on 72 stitches. So you have 2 choices here. You can cast on all of your stitches onto one needle and then take half of them and slip them to a second needle, or you can cast on half and then cast on half onto the other needle, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to use the long tail cast on. You can use whatever cast on you prefer for knitting your socks. I've got to make sure I've got a nice length of yarn. So I'm going to cast on half my stitches, 36, onto this first needle. So I've cast on half of my stitches for the first half of my sock. Now I'm going to cast on the other half onto here, but if you wanted to, you could cast them all onto one needle and then slip them. And to slip them, all you do is push these stitches up. You would hold your needles just like this, tip to tip, and slip that stitch. You're not changing the stitch mount, you're sort of slipping it purlwise. You're just going to do that. If you want to do that, you can, but I'm going to demonstrate how to cast on with another needle. I sort of slide my stitches up because I don't want to have a big gap between the two needles. Then I'll hold this one underneath the first, grab my yarn for my cast on, and I'm just going to get myself in position. The first few, it's a bit tricky, and then once you find your rhythm again, then it gets much easier. So we'll cast on, but we're going to use this second needle instead of the first, and pull it tight up to that one, because we don't want a gap right there. There we go. We've got a few, so now we can just continue on. I can push the stitches down on this one, sort of try to get it out of my way, and continue casting on the remaining half of my stitches onto this second needle. So once you've cast on, count your stitches, make sure you have the correct amount. We're going to turn our needles so the yarn that is attached to that last stitch is on our back needle, very similar to how you would do with magic loop. Now our other stitches are on the front needle, and we want to get them attached, of course, right here, but I'm checking, make sure nothing is twisted. Everything looks like it's one smooth line. Get them back here in position. I want to slide these front stitches up onto this needle tip because I'm going to join them with my third needle. And I like to work the first stitch with my tail and my working yarn. I'm going to bring them both up over this back needle. Again, very much like magic loop. So this first stitch I'm going to work with both of these lengths of yarn. We're just going to knit it, and then I can separate the two, find the tail. I'm going to get that out of the way, drop it down in between, and then I can continue knitting just with this needle. And our pattern, it's a 2 round repeat. The first round is just a knit 2, purl 2. So I've already knit one. I'll knit another stitch, and now I'm going to purl 2. And excuse any noises, these needle tips are long and they keep hitting the table, so they do make a bit of a noise. So you're just going to continue knitting and purling, knit 2, purl 2 across both needles. Now, depending on your stitch count, your first needle might end with a knit 2 or it might end with a purl 2. So just pay attention. If it's a purl 2, then you'll start the pattern right again on the next side. But if it ends with a knit 2, then the next needle is going to begin with a purl 2. So just pay attention to that. You want to keep that pattern all the way around on your sock. So I'm coming up on the end of my first needle. These are my heel stitches, by the way, when we work later on. Mine ends with a purl 2, so I know I can start with a knit 2 on the other side. If yours ends with a knit 2, then remember to start with a purl 2. When we turn our work, move that empty needle to our right hand. Make sure everything is still looking okay here. We don't want to twist right here on where these two needles join. So we push these stitches up onto the needle. Our working yarn, I think it's easier to have it sort of hanging over the back. And we'll continue the pattern on this side. Knit 2, purl 2. That first one I do like to snug up right against this needle to avoid any ladders. And I also like to have the needle tip I'm working with underneath. I don't know why, but that seems to help me not have any ladders in this position as I work that first stitch. The last needle I worked the stitches onto is on top, and the needle I'm using now is underneath, and I just sort of snug them up right together. I'm not really tightening up these stitches, but I am sort of working them a little more firmly, and now I'll go back to my normal tension after those first few stitches. And these needles, when the needle you're not using can feel, it's hard to figure out where to put it, like if you want to push it behind with your hand or fold it underneath. As you're working with them, you'll find the method that you like to use, but it's a bit finicky at first when you're just getting your first few rounds. Once you have a few rounds, it does get a little bit easier, and you start to figure out where you want those other needle tips to be as you're working across these stitches. So I'm at the end of this needle, so I can turn my work again and start our next round. And for round 2, we are just going to knit across the stitches. No purling or anything, just knitting around. That will give us a bit of garter stitch where those purl 2s are. Now, we do want to remember that this first stitch actually has 2 heads right here because we used our yarn tail as well. And if you tighten up on that yarn tail, it closes up this gap very nicely. So slide these stitches up and get your working yarn, and you're just going to knit across these stitches and then knit across the stitches on the second needle. So I'm turning, making sure things aren't twisted around one final time, and get my needles together, slide these up, working yarns back here. My needle tip that I want to use, I come from underneath this needle in the back, knit this first stitch, pulling it closely to this needle tip, and that back stitch is on the needle. It's not down on the cord. We don't want to tighten that too much, but we just want to remove any ladders right here, and I'm tightening on this second stitch as well. Then I'm going back to my normal tension and knitting across. Then after you've done a few stitches, you can move that back needle. You can either, a few options are to sort of grip it in your hand, so it's sort of underneath your fingers as you're working. Or, which I think I prefer to do, is I just sort of like flick it out of the way. I leave it on top of those fingers there, the fingers I'm not really using. Just push it out of the way so it's not in the way. But as you're knitting around, that's something you're going to play around with to see what's most comfortable for you. Once you get a few rows going, then you'll just start to find the way it's most comfortable for you. So this side, I sort of just flick out of the way with my fingers. The other end of this needle, I actually have underneath in my hand. So I've got both needles that I'm gripping under here, not tightly. I'm just sort of holding them together as I work. But I think it's this end that seems to be the harder one to figure out what to do with, because it's kind of just hanging out here, flopping around. So you can fold it under as you knit, which isn't too bad, but I sort of tend to just push it out of the way with my fingers. So once you have these 2 rows or 2 rounds done, we're going to stop, place our beginning of round marker, or you can just use the yarn tail that sort of marks the beginning of round as well. And we're just going to continue working these 2 rounds for the length of the leg, the cuff and the leg. It's all one, since we're going to continue that rib pattern right down onto the sock itself. So I finished that round. Those are my first 2 rounds. I'll place a marker there just as a reminder that this is the beginning right here. And now we're just going to continue knitting those 2 rounds until that sock leg is as long as you want it to be. I prefer shorty socks, so I think I did 18 rounds for this part, which is about 1.5 inches. So you can make this as long or as short as you want. If you want like a full length, and go 5 or 6 inches. And then we'll come back and we're going to start working our heel flap, our heel turn, and our gusset pickup. So this part, you're just going to continue working those 2 rounds, alternating between a knit 2, purl 2, and a knit round. The last round you're going to work is that knit round. You want to finish with that so we can maintain that pattern across the rest of the sock. We don't want to have to interrupt the pattern anywhere. So make sure your final round that you work is a knit round, and we'll be ready to start our heel flap and gusset. So the cuff and leg are as long as I want them to be. So now it's time to set up to work our heel flap, this square of fabric along the back of the sock. We do have a bit of a setup to do here because we want to begin and end with those garter stitches that we have in between our purl stitches here, because we're going to use those to pick up. So for all the sock sizes, you're just going to knit the first 2 stitches. Then we're going to slip these stitches to this other needle, to our instep stitches. So it takes just a bit of maneuvering to slip them over here. We're not changing the stitch mount. We're holding our needles tip to tip and just slipping them right there. So at this point, we have 2 extra stitches, 2 stitches more on our instep than we do on our heel flap. Now, at this point, if you look at your sock, half the sizes are now going to begin and end with these garter stitches. So we've got 2 stitches here that are garter stitch, and I already have 2 stitches here that are garter stitch. But on half the sock sizes, because of the number of stitches in your circumference for your sock, this first half of your stitches, you ended with a knit 2 right here, but we don't want that. We want to have purl stitches over here. So if you are knitting along with me and you look at your stitches that are now on your needle 1 and they should now begin with 2 purl stitches, and they should end with 2 purl stitches. If they don't and you end with 2, I'll cover mine up right here, and they end with 2 knit stitches, what you're going to do is you're going to borrow 2 stitches from needle 2. So all you're going to do, pretend that I have that issue here and I need 2 purl stitches. So I'm just going to slip them over to this needle. That's all you need to do. Now, of course, I've got to slip mine back because I don't have that issue with my sock, the number of stitches on my needle. So that's all you're doing. We knitted 2, but then we slipped them to our needle 2, to our instep stitches, because we're going to start working back and forth for our heel flap. And then on this side, we want to make sure we also end with those garter stitches. We don't want to end with 2 purl stitches. So if you need to, you're going to borrow 2 stitches from this side of needle 2 and slip them over here. So the pattern will tell you specifically if you have to do that, but you can tell by looking at your stitches. And then the pattern will also tell you how many stitches you should have. In my case, I started with 72 stitches. I had 36 stitches on each needle, but then to maintain this pattern, I had to slip 2 to my instep. So now I'm going to be working on just 34 stitches. But in the case of those people who have to slip stitches, from this needle 2 to needle 1, you'll go back to your original stitch count. If I had done that, I would have gone back to having 36 stitches. So that's just it's all spelled out for you in the pattern, but I just wanted to explain it here because really the main point is we want to work on approximately half your stitches. You want to begin and end with 2 of those garter stitches. That's the important part because we're going to be using those to work our heel flap and to pick up stitches for our gusset. So at this point for the heel flap, we're not going to be working on any of the stitches on needle 2. We're going to be working back and forth just on the stitches on needle 1. So we just need our empty needle and these stitches on this first needle 1 right here. And the rows are going to follow. We're going to work them in a very simple, very basic manner. We're not slipping any stitches. We are just going to maintain this pattern. So we're going to purl 2 stitches, knit 2 stitches, and then continue doing that until the end. We're going to purl 2, knit 2 until we get to those last 2 stitches, which will be another purl 2. So we're at the end of our stitches on needle 1, purl 2, and we're done. And we're not going to work needle 2. We are going to turn our work, but we're turning so we can work back across these stitches. And on our wrong side rows, because we're working these stitches on the wrong side. You're just going to purl across. No slipping these edge stitches. You want to purl them because we're forming little garter edges and we're going to use those to pick up the stitches. And I have to say, I really like it. I think I like it better than the slipped stitch edge. They're easy to pick up, and they just look really nice. And I don't end up with any little gaps or holes that you can sometimes get from slipped stitch edges. So I'm at the end of this wrong side row. So I'm going to turn and I'm going to work back in the other direction until we have basically a square of fabric right here. So I'm going to just follow those two rows. I'm going to purl 2, knit 2 to the end, finishing with a purl 2, turn my work, purl across, and that will maintain this garter rib pattern. We'll have these pretty columns of purl stitches and then these columns of garter stitch in between. So you're going to just continue doing this, following the pattern. It will tell you how many times to repeat it. Basically, it's the same. We want the same number of rows as you have stitches. I have 34 stitches here. I'm going to keep knitting until I've completed 34 rows. And then once we've finished with that, it'll be time to work our heel turn. So keep knitting until you have finished your heel flap. So the last row you work is a wrong side row. So you're right back here again. Our heel flap is complete, our big square of fabric for the back of our sock. Now we need to work on this part, the heel turn, this little bit of fabric right on the bottom. And you can see it's more of a sort of a triangular shape. So we need to start by dividing these stitches directly in half. So grab one of those stitch markers, and your stitch count should be easily divisible by 2. You're going to find that halfway point. I think mine's right here. I'm going to put it there and then I'll count and check. Yep. Okay, so we place a marker right directly in the center. So you should have an equal number of stitches on either side of this marker. And it will be right in the middle of one of your garter stitch sections. So from here, we're going to continue just working back and forth just on these stitches. So the first thing we'll do is slip our first stitch. We're holding our needle tips point to point, slipping it purlwise. The yarn's held to the back of the work. Then we're going to knit to that marker that we just placed. So right to the marker, we slip that marker. And we're going to work in SSK, so slip 2 stitches and knit them together through the back legs. And then we knit 1 more stitch and we're going to stop. We're not going to work any more stitches on this side. We're working short rows. We're stopping short of finishing the row. So we come to the marker, slip the marker, work in SSK, knit 1, and now we turn our work and we're going to work back in the other direction. And this one's even going to be shorter. So we're going to slip this first stitch tip to tip. The yarn's held towards us this time. I'm going to purl this stitch, slip this marker, purl 2 stitches together, purl 1 stitch, and we're going to stop, and we're not going to work these stitches here. We're going to turn our work. Okay, now that is our setup. And if you look, you can see there's a big gap right there. And that's what we're going to look for from now on. You could take the marker out at this point if you want. I'm just going to leave it in there. So from here, all of our right side rows are going to look like this. We're going to slip this stitch. The yarn's held to the back. We're going to knit to that gap, to 1 stitch before it, I should say. So there's that gap. I'm 1 stitch before the gap, and we're going to work a decrease, closing up this gap. So we're going to work an SSK. So slip that stitch as if to knit, this stitch as if to knit them together, knit 1 more stitch. And then we stop and we turn. And that turn is what is going to cause this next gap when we come over to that side again. And then on the wrong side rows, we're going to slip that first stitch, but the yarn's held towards us this time. we're going to purl to 1 stitch before the gap on that side. So if you want to just take the marker out now, you can. I'll just leave it there for reference for myself so I know that I've got my heel stitches going. We want to make sure we have the same number when we're done. So, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to keep it in or take it out. So we're 1 stitch before the gap. Purl them together, the stitch on either side of that gap. Purl 1, and then turn the work. So we're just going to repeat those 2 rows. You can see we've got another gap here, and it's going to slowly eat up all the stitches over here and also add stitches here. So we'll have our heel stitches all finished when we get to either side, working all of those stitches. So we're going to just continue doing that, slipping that first stitch, knitting to that gap, and then decreasing and closing up that gap and working 1 more stitch. So continue working these rows back and forth until you have used up all of the stitches that are on either side. I'm working my last right side row. There's my decrease and knitting that final stitch. So now this needle is empty. I'm not working. I've worked all of the stitches on this side. Now I have to finish. I still have a few more stitches to work over here. And you can see how this heel turn has sort of made this little pocket, and now we can start knitting sort of in the other direction. We worked this way, and now this heel turn is giving us the chance to move in a different direction. So now it's time for the last wrong side row. So we slip that stitch. We're going to purl to that gap, which is right over on those last few stitches. And here we are. There is our gap. 1 stitch before and 1 stitch after the gap. We purl them together to close it up. And we knit or purl our final stitch. And our heel turn is done. At this point, this is what things look like. Our instep stitches are still hanging out right here. We've done our heel turn. This is a good time to stop and check. Make sure your stitch count is correct. And you can remove the marker at this point. We don't need this anymore. Now we still do want to mark that beginning of round so if you don't want to take this marker out, because that's still going to be our beginning of round. Now we need to get all of this gap closed up so we can start working. And this is where we have kind of a long section just to get things set up. It's not difficult, but there's a lot to do here. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is our working yarns here. So we're going to just knit across our heel stitches. Now we are ready to pick up stitches for the gusset along this edge. So what I'm going to do, instead of picking up and knitting them individually, we're going to pick them all up first with this empty needle. And what I like to do is sort of turn this, and we're going to pick up the garter bumps right here. And now the garter stitch heads there's the head for 1 stitch, and then here's the head for the other that's connected to the row above. Now you can pick up right along that edge if you want. You're just going to pick up the heads of the stitches along there, those garter bumps. But I actually prefer to go in between those 2 stitches. Here's 1 stitch right here, and this stitch, the other stitch is over here, and this little connector right between them, when you're looking at it in the proper direction, it looks like a little frown between these 2 garter stitches. That's what I want to pick up. And the pattern will tell you how many to pick up. You're going to pick up 1 garter bump for every 2 rows, plus 1 extra right here, because we don't want to have, this is where you usually end up with a hole when you're joining to work in the round again. So we're going to pick up an extra one right along here. So I'm going to pick up 18 altogether. The pattern will tell you exactly how many you need for your size. So I'm going to use my empty needle for this part. I'm going to start here at the bottom, right by this, where the stitches are on this needle. That first bump is right there. So it looks like a little frown when we're looking at it from this direction. And I'm just going to follow those little bumps right up until I've picked them all up. Now, if you're used to doing the slip stitch edge, this might seem a little bit weird or different, but once you get the hang of it, I think I actually prefer this one. You just have to pay attention. You're not picking up the garter stitch right here. You want to leave one garter stitch along that side. We're picking up between them. That will give us a tiny bit of a seam on the inside of our sock because we're not picking up right along the edge. But the trade-off with that is that the end result just looks very nice and there's no gaps and no holes. Okay, so I'm all the way back up at the top. I think that's where my heel turn happened. So I'm going to stop and check and make sure I have what I need. I need the number I needed for my rows, which was 17 bumps plus 1 extra to close up any holes down here. Okay, I have 18, so I am all set to start. So I'm going to turn this around. So this is what it looks like at this moment. The yarn's right here. So we're going to just use this heel needle to knit across just like these are stitches. We just pick them up. We're going to knit them just like they were stitches. But the one thing to remember is this last stitch. We're not going to work that one just yet. We want to connect it with that instep to close up the hole. So get your needles. You might have to move them around a little bit to make them comfortable. But the heel stitch needle, you're going to push your stitches up. We're going to use this needle to knit across these stitches we've just picked up. And this is the first half of our gusset. So I'm coming up on the end here. I'm going to knit that last one. Now I'm going to stop with needle 1 and I've got 1 stitch left here. I'm just going to slide it down and we're going to slide it up and put it on this needle with our instep stitches. Okay, so we're done that part right now. Now we have to knit across our instep stitches. We want to maintain our pattern, but the first thing to do is close up this potential gap. So we're just going to knit 2 together, that stitch that we slipped and our first stitch. Then we're going to work our instep pattern. So knit 1 and then purl 2. Knit 2, purl 2, and I'm going to continue that pattern to the end of the instep. So we're in the last 2 stitches. I have purled 2. I'm going to knit 1. Now this last stitch we're going to join with our first gusset stitch. So right now I'm just going to slip it knitwise because it's going to be the first part of our decrease. So insert as if to knit, just slip that stitch for now. Now we've got our instep stitches are still on this needle. We've got a lot of stitches on this needle. So now we're going to pick up stitches here, but I'm actually going to do it with this needle. It's pretty full, but I'm just going to sort of slide things down, start right here at the bottom and pick up those stitches. Just like the other side, we're not picking up the stitch, we're picking up between 2 stitches. So that first one can be a little hard to find. Looks like it's right here. Nope. This is also because I'm looking in the wrong direction. I have to flip it over because we want it to be, because we knit in this direction. So if I'm looking at it this way, it's actually upside down. So I'm going to look at it in this direction. Get my first one going, and that will help me know where I should be. So from this side, there, we've got that first 2 picked up. So now I can turn it around and see what it looks like. Okay, so when I flip it over, it looks like I'm right in the middle of a stitch. I'm picking up the frown right here, or the head of that stitch. So there's 3, 4, 5. I'm just going to continue picking up all of my stitches. And the last one is on the same place that we just worked across on the instep. So I'm going to stop and count to make sure I've got them all. Nope, I am missing one. So must be one more here I should pick up. Just above where that one is. Right there. Okay, so check one more time, make sure I didn't miss one somewhere, because that can happen too. But everything looks good. I've got them all picked up now. Check one more time. There. Okay, so I've got them all. This is kind of a lot of stitches going on right now. But what I want to do is connect this stitch I just slipped and this very first gusset stitch right here. So I'm going to sort of, just for this first stitch, just knit that first one. And then take this stitch that I slipped and just pass it right over. There. And that should close up any gaps right there. So now I can go back to my empty needle and I'm just going to knit the gusset stitches, or these stitches that I just picked up. Doing this first one very firmly because I don't want a hole right here. So I'm going to knit these, in my case, 17 more gusset stitches. There, so I've finished with the gusset stitches. This is sort of what we look like right now, but I'm just going to continue knitting around until I get back over here to my beginning of round. So I'm going to keep knitting across these heel stitches with this needle. So I'm going to have a lot of stitches. All of those heel and gusset stitches are going to be on one needle, and all of my instep stitches are on the other. But our instep pattern is just knit across. So at this point, we're just knitting across all of these stitches and then knitting across the instep to the beginning of round. Okay, so I'm back to my beginning of round, and I'm going to move my marker up just a bit to where those, right there, just so I recognize that this is the beginning of round point for me. Now we have done all of the hard work. We've picked up all those stitches, worked our heel turn. Now the last thing to do is work our gusset decreases till we're back down to our original stitch count, and then just continue knitting until the length of the sock is as long as you want it. So I'm going to show you how to do the gusset decreases. And we also, at the same time we're decreasing, we want to maintain the stitch pattern on the top of the foot. So for the decreases, we're starting right here at our beginning of round. We're going to decrease here, and we're going to decrease at this end of this needle as well. So for this first side, near our beginning of round marker, we're going to knit one, pulling that firmly to hold that in place, and then SSK. Slip 2 stitches and knit them together. Now I'm going to knit to the last 3 stitches on this heel needle, this needle 1. And this can feel a little cumbersome. There are a lot of stitches here, so I find I end up holding, like cupping around the heel itself just to make things more comfortable, but you might find a way that you can hold these that is most comfortable for you. As we get back down to our normal stitch count, that will change again. Okay, I'm coming up here on the last few stitches on my heel and gusset. So when we have 3 left, we're going to knit 2 together and then knit 1 stitch, and that takes care of those heel stitches. And I should have sort of pushed them up onto the needle because there's a lot of them. Now I can work across my instep, and we want to work in pattern on this, on the decrease round. We're decreasing here. We're maintaining the knit 2, purl 2 pattern. So you should start and end with a knit 2. Work those first ones tightly to close up any ladders right there, and then purl 2. And just maintain that pattern across the instep on this round. And my last 2, I am going to knit. And now that takes care of the first round, and round 2 of these 2 rounds is just knit. You're going to knit all the way around, knit across your heel stitches, and then knit across your instep stitches. And then repeat this decrease round where we decrease at both ends and work in pattern across the instep. And you are just going to continue working those 2 rounds until you're back to your normal stitch count. The stitch count you started with, we're going to keep decreasing until we're back to that stitch count. So I finished knitting the length of my sock. You can see right here is where I finished those gusset decreases. And when I was back down to my original stitch count, and remember for half the sizes, you'll have 2 more stitches on their instep and 2 less stitches on your heel, but it'll still total out to that total number we cast on. So once those decreases were finished, I just knit across the stitches along the heel, and then on the instep we have that 2 round repeat, but on 1 round we are knitting 2 and purling 2 all across right to the end, and then finishing with another knit 2. Then on the next round we are just knitting across. So you just want to maintain that stitch pattern down the length of the leg. Once those gusset decreases are done, you're just going to knit the foot as long as you need it to be. The pattern will tell you how long that should be for the size you are knitting. It's more or less 2 inches that we leave for the toe. So for the smaller sizes, it's slightly less. For the larger sizes, it's slightly more. And when you get to that required length that you need, it's time to readjust our stitches perhaps, and then we're going to start our toe. So I say perhaps because if you remember back to our heel, we had to adjust the stitches to make sure we could center that stitch pattern across our heel flap. So to do that, we had to adjust the beginning of round by knitting 2 and slipping those to the instep. And then for half the sizes, to center that stitch pattern, we had to take 2 stitches from the instep and bring them back to the heel on this side. So for those sizes that had to do both steps, they had to knit 2 here, and they slipped 2 back from this needle 2 to needle 1. You should have an even number of stitches on both needles. But for the other half of the sizes, like the size I knit, I have 2 less stitches on my instep than I do, or on my heel than I do on my instep. I have 38 stitches here and 34 stitches here. And I want to even things up before I start my toe because we're going to divide it into 4 equal sections. So all I'm going to do, and I want my toe, of course, to be centered with my heel stitches. So I have 2 more on the instep than I need. So I'm going to take 1 from each end to add them to the heel stitches. So all you do is slip that 1 stitch tip to tip. We're not changing the stitch mount or anything like that. We're slipping 1 from this end, and then we want to do the same on the other. But the problem here is we've already worked that final stitch. So what I'm going to do is sort of just unwork it for now. So I'll catch the stitch underneath and take this stitch that I worked off. And now you can always check to make sure, but you should have an equal number of stitches on each side. So adjust if you need to. Half the sizes will have to do that. Half the sizes won't. And then we can divide our toe up. We're going to divide it, and this is when we need those 2 markers. We're going to take our stitches on this side and divide them in half. And then we're going to repeat that on the instep. So you want to find that halfway point. Good. So once you have your toe, or where we're going to work the toe divided, we have 4 sections right here. And we're going to work the same instructions for each of those sections. For our for our decrease round, we're going to knit to 2 stitches before the marker, knit 2 together. We're going to repeat that here. Now it says marker and slip marker, but we really don't have a marker here. You could put one there if you wanted to, but we're going to use the end of our needle as our marker. And then we'll repeat that every other round, alternating between just a plain knit round. So I'm going to start with my decrease round. So our instructions are to knit to the marker. Okay, so I'm 2 stitches before the marker, I knit 2 together. flip the marker, and I'm going to repeat that for this next section. Now the end of the needle acts as my marker, so I will knit 2 together. Then I turn and repeat that for the instep stitches. We're done working our garter rib pattern. Now we're just going to work our decreases and work in stockinette. So I will repeat on this side of the sock. In the last few stitches, knit 2 together. And that is the decrease round. And now the next round I am going to work on is a knit round. I'm just going to knit all the way around. Then I'll work another decrease round, then I'll work another increase, or not increase, I'll work another plain round, and I will just keep repeating those rounds, alternating between a decrease round and a plain knit round until I have about 1/3 of my stitches left. The pattern will tell you how many stitches that will be for your size. Then from that point on, we're going to skip knitting the plain round and just continue knitting the decrease round until there's just 8 stitches left. So I will come back and show you what we're going to do when we just have those 8 stitches. So you're going to alternate between your decrease round and plain knit round until about 1/3 of the stitches remain, and then you're just going to do that decrease round until you have 8 stitches left. And this creates sort of this swirl shape. Now this one actually goes in a different direction. The one we're creating right now is going to slant off this way. And then after, I'll show you how I made this one slant in a different direction. My last decrease rounds for the toe, where it's a knit 1 and a knit 2 together. Then we can take our markers out. We're done with those. And now we have just 8 stitches left, and we have a few choices for closing up the top with these last few stitches. Now, if you wanted to, I'm just going to break my yarn here and thread a tapestry needle with that tail. Now the first choice is just to draw this yarn through all of the loops. Get it untangled here. Just like you would for like the top of a hat or something, you would just slip all of these stitches to your tapestry needle and then tighten it up, bring the tail to the inside and weave in the ends. You can certainly do that. The other option is to do just a little bit of a Kitchener graft, which is what I'm going to do. I'm not doing the setup rounds or anything. I'm just doing the basic front needle, back needle motion just to get these last few stitches off. You don't have to do this. You can just loop it through just like you would for the top of a hat, but I like the way it looks when you do a Kitchener graft. So we slip the first one off as if to knit, leave the next stitch on, we insert as if to purl, and all of this is spelled out in the pattern as well. And then on the back needle, insert as if to purl, drop it off, and then insert as if to knit, but leave it on. And bring that yarn under the needle. We don't want it carried over. Tighten it up a little bit. Repeat that on the front needle. Insert as if to knit and drop it off. Insert as if to purl and leave it on. And the back needle. Insert as if to purl, drop it off, insert as if to knit and leave it on. We just have 2 stitches left now, so we're just going to work them both together and be all complete. So this front needle we insert as if to knit, and then we insert as if to purl, and we can drop that one off as well. And the back needle is insert as if to purl, insert as if to knit, and drop that off. Then we can adjust our graft at this point. My stitches are a little bit large here, so I'll just pull that yarn over to the tail. There we go. That looks better. Well, maybe I'll tighten it up a little bit more, but all I have left to do now at this point is to weave in my ends. And I do want to show you, if you want your sock toes to like sort of swirl off in different directions, the one we just did is like the one that swirls off this way, off to the right. But then you can also work it in the opposite direction, as we see here on this toe, where it swirls off to the left, which is what I did. I did mine in 2 opposite directions. So if you want to do that, then I'm going to show you the instructions for that, or just work both toes exactly the same. It's really not that big of a difference. I just wanted to give you the choice. If you want them to be mirror images of each other, this one goes sort of that way and that one goes that way, then we're just going to do a little bit of a different setup here with some SSKs worked at the beginning. But I'm going to show you how to do that right now. Then after that, your socks are finished and it's time to weave in the ends. And enjoy your new pair of socks. Knit on flexible double pointed needles. So what do you do if you want your toe to spiral in the opposite direction? I've gone back in time just a little bit to show you how I did the very first sock. So we've got our markers set up already. I've slipped my stitches so we have an equal amount on both needles. I've placed markers so we have 4 sections of 18 stitches each. Your stitch count might be different, but you'll have 4 equal sections. Now instead of knitting to the marker and knitting 2 together, we're going to work a decrease right at the beginning. This time we're going to work an SSK. And that's the only difference. We slip those first 2 stitches, knit them through the back legs, and I'm going to knit to the marker, slip that marker, and repeat the whole process again right here. SSK, knit to the end of this marker, or well, really the end of the needle, and I'm going to repeat the process for the other side of the sock. That's the only difference. Now I'm going to work a knit round and then use that decrease round again and keep repeating that until I get a sock that spirals in the opposite direction from our other one. It'll go spiraling that direction instead of that direction. Now that you've finished that first sock, it's time to cast on and knit your second sock. So why not settle in and watch an episode of Knit and Chat, where we sit and chat about our knitting, and the topic for this episode was all about the proper care of your finished socks. Something you'll need to know how to do now that you've knit a pair of socks. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.